Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of AVD Monthly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. Got a good group of folks with me. I've got Vadim Vladimirskiy from Nerdio, who is really our superstar subject matter expert. But backing him up is Greg Roberson, also from Nerdio. And if you don't know what Nerdio is, it's a technology that takes Microsoft-related end-user compute, and Vadim's been doing this for years. I'll ask him to just recap that briefly. But takes the Microsoft stack and takes it to another level, specifically in today's world around Azure Virtual Desktop, also known as AVD, formerly known as Windows Virtual Desktop. So Vadim, we talked earlier about some ServiceNow and Nerdio stuff, but good to have you on again. How are you?
Good to be here. I'm doing well, Andy. How are you?
I'm good. Somebody a while ago asked me if I was busy. Well, I asked him first if he was busy, and he said, nah. And really, I knew he is, right? But in our world, in this technology world, you're pretty much always busy. It's just how you choose to answer that question.
That's true. It's hard to say you're not, right?
Yeah. If you're not, you're doing something wrong, or you got a great job somehow. I know you travel a lot. Are you anywhere special, or are you actually home?
I am actually in my home office today, so it's nice to actually be at my desk with with my two big monitors in front of me. So I am working from home today.
So that's an interesting topic, because I just went back in one of my sales guys' rooms, and he didn't have his dock with him at the new desk he's working at. And I'm like, why? And he's like, well, I don't need it right now. And I'm like, how are you sitting there on that laptop getting productivity done at the rate I need you to get it done? And the truth is, he's a Generation Z guy, and he's awesome. At the same time, that world where he's older and he needs the big screens and he needs the big keyboard and the big mouse, that hadn't caught up with him yet. So where he can be effective without it.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel the lack of productivity when I'm working on the road. I usually travel with an iPad, with one of those keyboards and touchpads attached to it. That's sort of my mobile device. Yeah. I'm pretty fast and efficient on it, but there's definitely a category of tasks I set aside to do when I'm back at the desk.
Yeah, and if you're like me, when you fly, I don't know, I just can't bring myself to fly first class, and I don't want to spend the money. So I'm crunched in the emergency row at best, trying to get work done on a little laptop or a big laptop, which is part of my problem. Greg, how's it going?
It's going quite well. Just got back into the office myself this week.
Now, when you say office, do you mean home office or do you mean office?
Home office. I've worked from home office for almost 20 years now.
Yeah. And Vadim, when you said office, did you mean home office or do you mean office?
Home office.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because people that work in the technology vendor world, we haven't been in offices in a really long time, if ever. The whole world's working like us now.
We just wouldn't admit to it, right? You would never say I'm working from home today. Now, everyone's working from home. So no shame in admitting it.
And the only thing is, like, now we have these virtual backgrounds. I swear this is true. A friend of mine, really, who works for another vendor. His dirty towel is hanging in the background in a meeting one time. I was like, hey, can you take that down? I mean, it looks horrible.
Yeah, those virtual backgrounds are definitely a lifesaver when you don't want everyone knowing what's going on behind you.
Yeah. Well, today's topic, as always, is the latest with AVD. So I've pulled up the June updates, which there's only 3, and we can go into as much detail as you want. And then we're going to jump into the parallel things that have happened in the world of Nerdio in that same time period. But I want to ask you guys, is the fact that there's only 3 things to talk about here, is that a sign that Microsoft is slowing down, that they've solved all the problems? Why only 3? Are they less interested than they were?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think it's a sign of them slowing down. It may be a sign of the time of year, just given the end of the fiscal year being just being over and new fiscal year started. Maybe it's related to that, but I definitely know there's lots of other things that are in the works. So I wouldn't take this as an indication of them slowing down and innovating with AVD. Greg, would you agree?
I would have totally agree, especially with it being Microsoft's end of year. Everybody's taking a deep breath for the past year before they get started on this new one here in the next week or so.
And I'll highlight for our listeners coming from you two guys, that's probably very accurate, because Microsoft truly does see Nerdio as an extension of their capabilities. So I know you guys can't go into detail about what they've got coming, but if they've got stuff coming, as you indicated, you would be the guys to know.
There's stuff in the works.
I wouldn't know. I can't tell you.
I'd have to shoot you, and that'd be hard.
Yeah.
On podcast.
Exactly.
All right, so here's what changed in June 22. That's exactly how it says it. Australia metadata service in public preview. We've probably talked about metadata in the past, but what does this mean just in general? And then I guess it's important that our friends from down under have it.
Yeah, so metadata is basically all of the Azure objects and resources that are used by the AVD service to sort of operate the VMs, the Azure Virtual Desktop VM. So it's things like workspace objects, things like app groups and session host registrations, right? All of the metadata that describes the actual VMs that are serving up the desktop. And initially, when WVD launched, metadata locations were limited to the US, and then slowly they expanded to Europe, and now they're expanding into other geographies. And that's important for customers who have regulatory reasons to keep their data and their metadata within a specific region or a specific geography. So Australia is the new one on the list. It's launched in public preview now. One question we get asked often is there a migration path? Like, can you go from, if you're an Australian customer and you deployed AVD in the US geography with metadata in the US geography, can you migrate metadata? And as far as I know, and Greg, maybe you can tell otherwise, but as far as I know, there is not a way to do that. You kind of have to deploy another workspace and migrate VMs into it. So that's kind of unfortunate, but it is really not that big of a deal where the metadata is, other than for compliance and data residency reasons.
Right.
Doesn't affect performance or anything like that.
And I was scrolling down. I knew this was a topic we covered before. The previous topic was around Japan. So do you guys know off the top of your head the countries or continents that now have localized metadata?
It'll be Australia, the US, and Europe right now. There's Europe, and then there's, I believe, Germany as well.
Japan was the one that we covered in May. So add that one, I guess, to the list, at least in preview.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, I think eventually it will come to all geographies. It's probably in most of them now. So, it's just a natural evolution of a growing service in Azure.
Yeah. Is there anything on the Nerdio side of the equation that that helps with the metadata, or are you just along for the ride?
Yeah, a couple of things to mention on the Nerdio side. Whenever Microsoft launches a new metadata geography, it becomes automatically available, so customers can see it and can deploy into it from within Nerdio Manager. And then in Nerdio Manager, we also have functionality that's often used for migration. So initially, we created it to help customers migrate from what was called the fall release or the WVD Classic to what was called the spring release or the current version of WVD or AVD ARM. And we have a method to help customers create a new workspace and then move host pool configurations and even VMs from one to the other. And occasionally customers who want to take advantage of the new metadata geography and actually migrate workloads into it, they use our migration functionality to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty powerful, actually. Okay, next topic on here says Intune user configuration for Windows 11 Enterprise multi-session VMs in public preview. So as you guys know, and hopefully our listeners know, multi-user configurations is a very important thing to XenTegra and to Nerdio. What is this gaining us by having Intune play along with Windows 11 Enterprise multi-session?
So, Intune, as we all know, is an endpoint, management solution. It lets you kind of manage the configuration of devices and users. It was supported for single session desktops for a while now in AVD, where you could, deploy policies and applications and target them to both devices, right, VMs, or individual users. And now in a single session or a single user deployment, a device equals a user because there's one user per device. So anytime you target a user, it knows which device it's supposed to go to. In a multi-session environment, you have sort of this extra level of complexity where you have a device that's shared by users and not in a permanent way, because they could be sharing a different device at some other time. So on another day when they log in. So this is pretty significant. This allows customers that are using Intune to manage their endpoints, whether those are physical endpoints, cloud PCs or AVD personal, to now manage AVD multi-session environments and target policies and certificates and scripts to run within the user context, which means it could run on different devices on different days, depending on where the user is logged in during that particular session.
Greg, any additional comments on that?
Nope. That was a pretty solid walkthrough of it.
Yeah, I think I would highlight that for most people, I don't think companies, especially coming out of like the Citrix world, where you have all these like machine creation service, golden master images, the power of having managed persistent machines, potentially managed by Intune, is an extremely extensible and scalable way to do desktop virtualization. Ideal world, we're rebooting back to a gold image every time. But for a lot of organizations, that's just not reality for all of their users. It might be for a subset, large or small. But the ability to understand and leverage Intune for both the middle PC, the virtual desktop, if you will, multi-session desktop, if you will, or the endpoint is really a pretty powerful end-to-end story. Anything in the Nerdio world that ties into this particular topic and how Nerdio benefits and can make this even better?
Yeah, a couple of things to mention from the Nerdio side. I mean, we do have integrations with Intune in a couple of our products. With our Nerdio Manager for Enterprise, we integrate with Intune to help with cloud PC management. And then in our Nerdio Manager for MSP product, we actually have a full stack integration with Intune that can do policies and application installs and scripted actions, and all sorts of Intune capabilities can be leveraged through Nerdio Manager. And having this support for multi-session VMs just sort of expands the capabilities of what Intune can do and what our MSP partners can do on behalf of their customers through Nerdio Manager.
What are you guys seeing in your MSP partners? So the people that use Nerdio to manage small to medium customers, are they taking advantage of multi-session desktops, or are they?
Yeah,
they are.
Yeah, primarily they're taking advantage of multi-session desktops and now cloud PCs. Whenever there is a personal desktop use case, we're seeing more and more Windows 365 usage. And then whenever there is an application, kind of a remote app or a multi-session use case, then they're definitely taking advantage of that.
And I think you hit on a key term there with the cloud PC portion of Microsoft, where it's basically your own PC, managed possibly by your company. You're going to have something like Intune to enterprise manage it, because it's not going to have some tie-in back to some gold imaging solution.
Right, exactly. It's got to be managed with Intune or some other method that can manage it as a physical device rather than a virtualized, non-persistent type of a thing like AVD can handle.
Yeah. Okay, the last, it's only 3. Teams media optimizations for Mac OS now generally available. That just seems weird, but I could see it being useful. I'm using an iGel Linux thin client right now to run this Zoom meeting. I can't offload it because my team doesn't have it turned on, but offloading is expecting that end user compute stuff to work with unified communications on whatever device you're on is just the reality if this stuff's going to be mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, you need that offloading for just even decent or acceptable performance. Otherwise, if Teams or any other video conferencing runs within the session without being offloaded, it's a little painful to use. So this is definitely a must-have functionality. Prior to this, it was available in Windows and in the Linux SDK, which is what iGel is taking advantage of. It came out in Mac OS and public preview, obviously first, and now it's part of the remote desktop client for Mac OS and can now take advantage of the offload. So very useful.
Yeah. Anything on the Nerdio front that benefits from this other than the fact that it's just part of the overall solution?
No, nothing in particular. I mean, it's part of the overall solution, and I think that's one of the kind of key advantages of the way that Nerdio integrates with AVD native is that whenever Microsoft innovates and adds this type of functionality, because we are not a replacement control plane, we don't have our own agents or clients or anything custom that goes into the stack, customers get to take advantage of these as soon as they come out from Microsoft. So nothing in particular that integrates with that in Nerdio, but customers get advantage of, to use it right away.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the topics I wanted to cover with you. We're talking about Microsoft's iterative development now and how quickly people can consume it. Now we're going to go over to Nerdio and for the release you guys have coming out within a week or so, 4.2, I believe you've got 24 iterative developments, and for customers to be able to turn these on and use them, it's just there, right? I mean, they don't have to do anything special.
It's there. I mean, a lot of it is kind of net new functionality. The vast majority of this is net new functionality that they have to, see that, hey, it's there. Here's how to use it. But yeah, they just need to update to the new release, and all the functionality is there for them. And we generally have a release, every 4 to 6 weeks. And this happens to be a very big one. Lots of features that ended up in this particular release. And we're certainly not slowing down. For the next one, I expect it to be just as significant.
Right. And in your world, you're putting icing on their cake whenever they have stuff that doesn't quite land completely the way it needs to. And at the same time, you're bringing in solutions to problems that they may or may not be addressing and may not even know they have.
Right. Exactly.
All right, so let's walk through these. AVD per user costing, that came up today where, customer wants solutions that are based on per user, whether it's 10 or 1,000. Part of your—
yeah. So let me sort of describe it. And I don't know if we'll have time to go through all of them. Plus, once this comes out, hopefully later this week, we'll have something to talk about during the next month's episode. So maybe I'll point out a few highlights. And then we can delve into the rest of them on the next episode here. So the first one, as you mentioned, Andy, on the list is what we call AVD per user cost reporting, which basically allows customers to allocate precise costs to individual users, right? So if you think about AVD, it's a collection of Azure services. You got your storage and compute and networking and log analytics. And, if you have Nerdio in the mix, you have Nerdio licensing, a bunch of stuff that goes into the mix. And different users use all of that at a different rate, right? You have some users using it a lot, logging in for many hours a month, and other users logging in for a short amount of time. And there's a great amount of variability. So what this will allow customers to do is actually pick a user or users, or get all of their user data, and see how much cost is associated with a specific user. So this is really the ultimate cost attribution and chargeback mechanism, where you can precisely tell how much of the consumption cost ties back to which specific user.
Yeah, kind of the nirvana of what we've all wanted in IT and cost accounting for, I don't know, 2 decades now. People started thinking it was going to be easy 2 decades ago, and it's still not.
Yeah, it's exactly that. I mean, when we went to the cloud, people thought, hey, now it's consumption based. It's going to be easier to, to do chargeback and attribution. But, yeah, you can do chargeback and attribution per subscription. That's pretty easy to do. You can sometimes do it per workspace if you properly kind of architect it, but doing it per user has been super challenging. And that's really what we aim to solve with this feature.
And in theory, the data's been there. It's like doing an Uber where you and somebody else get in a car versus doing a ride share where you and somebody else both schedule a ride and you share it. In both cases, there are ways to know what happened it's kind of, it gets to that world, where you got a service and being able to carve out per person what
Right.
it should cost.
Per person, and so it adds up to 100% of the total, no more, no less. So you're accounting for all of the cost, and you're fairly allocating it against each individual user in your user population.
Well, it's good that you said that, because in the past, right, we would add it up, but we would always be conservative and we would round up, and next thing you know, you end up charging extra to make sure you didn't undercharge.
Right. Right, exactly. So let me tell you about a couple of other ones just to highlight. We're doing quite a few enhancements to personal host pools, where personal host pools are obviously those that have dedicated VMs to each user that logs into that host pool. And personal host pools don't lend themselves to a lot of kind of automation where VMs can be created automatically and deleted automatically, because they're permanent, right? They're persistent per user. You can't just easily, take them out of the mix, because if users are using them, they need to be there. So we're doing a couple of things. One thing we're doing is called personal host pool auto grow. And what auto grow will do is it will dynamically expand the size of a personal host pool by adding new session host VMs when the number of available desktops falls below a predefined number or percentage of total VMs in the pool. So imagine you have an environment that's currently at 500 users, but is going to grow to 1,000. So you create 500 VMs, because you don't want to create 1,000 VMs, because the remaining 500 won't be used. So you'll create 500. And then as soon as those get consumed, you need to manually go in and create the next 10 and the next 10 and the next 10. And you kind of have to monitor to make sure you do that in time. So the VMs are not sitting there costing you money, but at the same time, the users are not waiting for a machine to become available. So this takes all of that manual work out of the mix. And as soon as the number of VMs falls below a threshold, it starts adding VMs to keep that condition to be true, where a certain number of VMs must always be available.
Right.
And if you think about the flip side of it, the shrinking part, right? So imagine you have a host pool where VMs are no longer used. Maybe the users left the organization or they stopped using personal desktops. So you have a bunch of VMs sitting there never being used, but there's really no good way to know, are they being used or are they not? We'll have the capability to shrink the pool by identifying idle users who've been idle for long periods of time, let's say 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and then removing those VMs from the pool, saving costs to the customer and kind of freeing up those resources.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the tech's got to be good, but the money's got to line up too.
That's right. That's right. And there are several things like that in this release. One other feature I'll mention that I'm fairly excited about is called dynamic resource recommendations and filtering. And this came back from a lot of customer feedback and requests where they were saying like, hey, can you recommend which VM I should use? Like, Azure has thousands of VMs, different, dozens of VM series and types. And I don't know which one is which. I don't know which one is available for me in my subscription. How many core quotas do I have? What region are they available in? Like it's pretty difficult to make the right choice. So people tend to default to the VMs that are always available everywhere, which tend to be the older families and the older versions. So what this does is it actually will take a look at what's available for you in your Azure subscription in the selected region and make a recommendation based on the latest available version that has sufficient core quota in the region availability. And it will also expose the pricing. So it will say, hey, if you go with this series VM, you're going to save this much relative to another series of VM. So it dynamically recommends what you should be using. And this is customizable. We have some out-of-the-box defaults, and then customers can create their own rules and their own filters to limit which VMs are available so that other members of the team don't have to make these choices.
And that is data-driven decisions.
That's right.
That's great. Hey, Vadim, any other highlights? You got 23 of them. Any other ones that
Yeah,
you want to cover?
yeah, there are lots of them, so maybe we'll save some for when this launches, and we'll be talking again in the next episode. I guess let me pick one more, number 10 on the list here. This also was a fairly frequently requested enhancement, and that is the ability to do advanced VM naming patterns. So when creating VMs and dynamic host pools and in multi-session host pools, VMs come and go. They get created, they get deleted. As more users log in, more VMs are added. And the naming was sort of based on a prefix with a randomly generated suffix.
Yep.
So what we've done is we've extended that with a more advanced naming configuration where you can have any VM format and you can use both sequential variables as well as random variables throughout the name of the VM. So you can imagine having, host dash 000, 001, 002. That's kind of the simpler way to do it. Or you can even have, random characters in addition to sequential characters. So this is to support some of the larger and more advanced customer setups that we are seeing.
Yeah, this is great. Hey, I have a question for you guys. So we'll pause here on the features, then we'll highlight 3 or 4 more next month when we talk about the July Microsoft releases, updates. Vadim, you guys are doing all these management related things that brings AVD up to close to being, if not on par with other players in the industry. The other players have maybe protocol related things, whereas we're relying on AVD. To help us understand where Microsoft is with the modern day RDP they're using in AVD compared to the other players, or how, in your opinion, how close are they?
Again, I'm probably going to have a biased opinion here, but I think RDP coupled with short path, right? So there's this new technology, RDP short path, which streams the desktop over the UDP channel rather than the TCP channel, really provides an on-par user experience from a performance perspective. Smooth video, really kind of seamless remote desktop operation. So RDP short path is something that Microsoft released for what they call managed networks. So for people who have like ExpressRoute, that's been in production or in GA for some time. They now have what they call RDP short path for public networks, which is in preview. And what that allows you to do is actually use this feature on public networks, just regular internet, without any special ExpressRoute or anything like that. And I think that kind of bridges another part of the gap between some of the other display protocols that are more advanced and RDP. So I think it's definitely getting there, and it's getting there fast, in my opinion. Yeah. If it isn't already there. I mean, there's certainly going to be use cases that each protocol is better at handling. The question is, out of the universe of end user computing use cases, what percentage is that? And I think that percentage where non-RDP protocols have advantage over RDP protocols is really shrinking to be some very small number.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I needed. And I had heard of short path. We probably covered it once, but I had lost track of it. But I'm going to go back and read these articles that I brought up on the screen here. It's now, is that limited to Azure Virtual Desktop environments? You're not going to do an RDP connection to your local server over this and have this in play, are you?
That's right. This is unique to AVD, which is, again, one of the ways Microsoft is encouraging adoption of that technology, is that it's got all of this new innovation that's being added to it pretty rapidly.
Yeah. Well, guys, this is great. I appreciate you helping me cover these topics, and we'll plan to do it again next month.
Sounds great. Again, thanks for having us. It's been fun.
Greg, you got off easy this time. You brought in the man.
Well, I don't know if he knew I was going to be back today or not, but I was happy to have him do it at least one last time. We seem to be doing quite well on the previous one, so we'll just continue that. And
yeah. So Vadim, we'll keep you on the invite. You show up whenever you want. Just know that Greg's probably got you covered.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Andy. Good to see you again, and have a good rest of your day.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Take care.